Pedro Alvarez hated parties. Loud music, sweaty strangers, drunk people screaming over each other like they were auditioning for reality TV. None of it made sense to him. But his roommate Mateo wouldn't stop begging. Come on, man. You spend every Friday night drinking tea and drawing sad little sketches like a divorced poet. Pedro rolled his eyes. I'm not a poet. Exactly. So get dressed. That was how Pedro somehow ended up inside the football team's giant Halloween party, wearing a black hoodie, while everyone else looked like they had stepped out of a magazine shoot. He stayed near the back wall most of the night with a plastic cup of soda in his hand, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. That had always been his strategy at Westbridge University. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. It worked most of the time. People rarely noticed him, and Pedro preferred it that way. High school had taught him what happened when people noticed too much. Unfortunately, Kenneth Walker noticed everything. Even before Pedro ever spoke to him, he knew exactly who Kenneth was. Everyone did. Captain of the football team. Campus golden boy. The guy professors loved, alumni adored, and half the school wanted to date. Kenneth had that kind of face people turned to stare at without realizing it. Tall, broad shoulders, messy dark brown hair, and the kind of smile that looked dangerous when pointed directly at someone. Pedro had seen him around campus plenty of times. In the cafeteria surrounded by teammates. Walking across campus with girls laughing at every word he said. On giant posters advertising football games. Kenneth Walker looked like someone who belonged in bright stadium lights. Pedro felt more comfortable in dim libraries. Around midnight, Pedro was seriously considering sneaking out early when the front door burst open and the football team came storming in from another party. The room immediately got louder. People started cheering. Someone yelled Kenneth's name. Pedro glanced up once and immediately regretted it. Kenneth was drunk. Not normal drunk either. Completely gone. His cheeks were red, jersey half untucked, and he looked like he'd forgotten gravity existed. His teammates were laughing while trying to keep him upright. Kenneth was grinning at everyone until suddenly his eyes landed on Pedro across the room. Everything changed. Kenneth froze. Then his entire face lit up like he'd just found something important. Baby! Pedro nearly choked on his drink. Before he could react, Kenneth pushed through the crowd toward him. People moved automatically to let him pass. Pedro stood there in horror while this massive football captain stumbled directly into him and wrapped both arms around his waist. You actually came? Kenneth slurred into his shoulder. The entire room went silent for about 2 seconds before absolute chaos exploded. Oh my God! No way! Kenneth has a boyfriend? Phones immediately came out. Pedro could practically hear screenshots happening in real time. Kenneth? Pedro hissed quietly, trying to push him back. You're drunk. I missed you. Kenneth tightened his grip instead. You ignored my texts, babe. I don't even have your number. Kenneth blinked slowly like this information deeply offended him. That's toxic. Somewhere behind them, people burst into laughter. Pedro wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. Then Kenneth somehow made things worse by dropping down onto the couch and pulling Pedro directly onto his lap like this was the most natural thing in the world. Pedro's entire body locked up. Kenneth. One of his teammates shouted while laughing. Since when are you hiding a boyfriend? Kenneth pointed dramatically at Pedro. This is my baby. The screaming got louder. Pedro covered his face with one hand. This could not be real. There was no universe where the most popular guy at Westbridge was currently cuddling him in front of half the campus. Kenneth rested his chin on Pedro's shoulder like he belonged there. You smell nice. You smell like whiskey. Still cute. Pedro's ears burned. The worst part was Kenneth looked weirdly comfortable holding him. Not awkward. Not performative. Comfortable. Like this was something he'd done before. Every few seconds Kenneth absent-mindedly played with the sleeve of Pedro's hoodie while mumbling random things under his breath. Eventually, Kenneth completely lost the battle against alcohol and fell asleep against Pedro's chest. Still holding him. Still refusing to let go. People kept staring. Some looked shocked. Some amused. A few girls looked heartbroken. One guy yelled, "Bro, one life." Pedro sat there for almost 10 minutes in complete disbelief before finally managing to drag Kenneth upstairs into an empty guest bedroom. Kenneth was heavy as hell. Halfway there, he nearly walked into a wall. "You good?" Pedro muttered. Kenneth blinked down at him sleepily. "You're pretty." Pedro stopped walking for half a second. Then Kenneth immediately passed out again. Great. Pedro dropped him onto the bed, pulled a blanket over him, and left the house before anyone else could stop him. The second he got back to his dorm, Mateo took one look at his face and burst into hysterical laughter. "No," Pedro warned. Mateo shoved his phone toward him anyway. Someone had already posted a photo online. Kenneth sitting on the couch with Pedro in his lap, smiling against his shoulder like he was completely in love. The caption read, "Campus King finally taken?" Pedro wanted to die. By morning, the entire school had apparently seen it. Students whispered when he walked into class. People smiled at him in the hallway like they suddenly knew a secret. One girl in the cafeteria literally grabbed his arm and asked, "How long have you and Kenneth been dating?" "We're not dating." She looked unconvinced. Across the cafeteria, Kenneth sat with his teammates laughing about something on his phone. He looked annoyingly good for someone who should have been dying from a hangover. Pedro immediately turned around to leave. Too late. Kenneth spotted him. His smile disappeared instantly. Then he stood up and started walking over. Pedro braced himself for embarrassment. Maybe Kenneth would apologize. Maybe he'd laugh and say it was all a drunken mistake. Maybe he'd pretend not to remember. Instead, Kenneth stopped in front of him looking genuinely nervous. "You're Pedro, right?" Pedro stared at him flatly. "You don't remember climbing onto me like a koala in front of 200 people? Kenneth closed his eyes briefly. "Okay. That bad? Huh. You called me baby 17 times. One of Kenneth's teammates behind him coughed. 23, actually. Kenneth looked horrified. Pedro almost laughed despite himself. "I'm sorry," Kenneth said quickly. "Seriously. I was drunk out of my mind." Pedro shrugged like it didn't matter even though his heartbeat was acting stupid. "It's fine." But Kenneth rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "People actually think we're together now." Pedro deadpanned. "Fantastic observation." Kenneth stared at him for a second before unexpectedly grinning. "Honestly? Could be worse." Pedro blinked. "What?" "You're kind of cute when you're annoyed." Pedro almost dropped his tray. Kenneth leaned casually against the table. "Look, if everyone already believes it." He lowered his voice slightly. "Maybe we just let them." Pedro thought he misheard him. "You want to pretend to date me?" Kenneth shrugged. "Fake dating could be fun." "Fun for who?" "For me." Kenneth grinned shamelessly. "People stop trying to set me up every 5 seconds, and you get instant campus popularity." "I don't want campus popularity." "Tragic." Pedro narrowed his eyes. "You flirt with everyone, don't you?" Kenneth smiled slowly. "Not everyone." That answer stayed in Pedro's head way longer than it should have. Before Pedro could respond, somebody walking past slammed into him hard enough to knock his books onto the floor. Papers scattered everywhere. The guy barely looked back. "Sorry, nerd." Pedro automatically crouched to pick everything up, but Kenneth moved first. "Hey!" His voice changed completely. The other guy turned. "Pick them up." The cafeteria went quiet. "It was an accident," the guy muttered. Kenneth took one step closer. "Then accidentally help." The guy immediately bent down and grabbed Pedro's papers. Pedro looked up at Kenneth in surprise. Kenneth handed him the books carefully. "You okay?" Pedro nodded slowly. Then Kenneth smiled again like nothing happened. "See? Fake boyfriend duties already." Pedro rolled his eyes, but something warm twisted in his chest anyway. Later that night, Pedro was sitting alone in the campus art building trying to finish a design project when someone dropped a coffee beside him. He looked up. Kenneth, wearing a hoodie this time instead of his football jacket. "You followed me?" Pedro asked. Kenneth sat beside him casually. I asked Mateo where you hide when you're stressed. Pedro groaned. Traitor. Kenneth looked down at the sketchbook beside Pedro. You draw. Pedro immediately reached for it. Too late. Kenneth had already seen the page. A rough pencil sketch of Kenneth himself running across the football field. Silence. Pedro wanted to throw himself out the nearest window. Kenneth stared at the drawing for several seconds before quietly asking, You made me look better than I actually do. How's that possible? Pedro looked away quickly. Give it back. Kenneth handed over the sketchbook gently this time. It's really good. There was no teasing in his voice anymore. No flirting. Just honesty. For some reason, that felt more dangerous than everything else. By the end of the week, everyone at Westbridge believed Pedro Alvarez and Kenneth Walker were dating. Not secretly dating either. Publicly. Loudly. Aggressively. Mostly because Kenneth refused to act normal for even 5 minutes. Every morning he showed up outside Pedro's first class carrying coffee like some overly dedicated boyfriend in a romance movie. Sometimes it was iced coffee. Sometimes hot chocolate. Once he brought a smoothie because he claimed Pedro looked vitamin deficient. You know this fake dating thing is supposed to look believable, right? Pedro muttered one morning while Kenneth walked beside him across campus. Kenneth looked offended. Excuse me. I'm an incredible boyfriend. You almost burned down the cafeteria microwave yesterday. That was one time. You put metal in it. Kenneth pointed at him dramatically. And yet you still look at me with love in your eyes. Pedro rolled his eyes and kept walking. But Kenneth only laughed louder. That was the problem. Kenneth laughed around Pedro constantly now. Real laughs too. Not the charming fake ones he used around crowds or cameras. Pedro started noticing the difference without meaning to. Kenneth had one smile for football interviews and another one for late-night conversations in empty hallways. And Pedro was starting to think the second one mattered more. A few days later, Kenneth dragged Pedro to football practice for the first time. I don't belong here, Pedro whispered while standing near the field fence. Kenneth jogged backward in front of him wearing full practice gear. Relax, babe. Nobody bites. Your linebacker literally looks like he eats furniture. Kenneth snorted. Practice started, and Pedro immediately understood why people were obsessed with Kenneth Walker. The second he stepped onto the field, everything about him changed. He moved fast, confident, sharp. His teammates listened the second he spoke. Even the coaches watched him differently. Kenneth wasn't just popular. He was good. Really good. Pedro found himself staring more than once before catching himself and looking away quickly. Unfortunately, Kenneth noticed everything. Halfway through practice he scored during a scrimmage play, immediately turned toward the fence, and pointed directly at Pedro with a grin. Several teammates started yelling. Oh! He did the boyfriend point. Pedro covered his face with both hands. Kenneth looked way too proud of himself. After practice ended, Kenneth jogged over sweaty and exhausted, grabbing a towel from his shoulder. So? He asked. So what? How amazing was I? Pedro looked at him flatly. Your ego is a public safety hazard. Kenneth laughed, then winced suddenly while rotating his shoulder. Pedro noticed immediately. You're hurt. I'm fine. You made that face. What face? The fake tough guy face. Kenneth looked personally attacked. Rude. But a few minutes later Pedro still ended up following him toward the private physical therapy room attached to the stadium. The second the door closed behind them, Kenneth's entire posture changed. His shoulders dropped slightly. He sat heavily on the treatment table and pressed fingers against his arm with a quiet hiss of pain. Pedro frowned. That bad? Kenneth shrugged. Dislocated it last season. It acts dramatic sometimes. Pedro stepped closer before he could think too hard about it. Let me see. Kenneth looked up at him for a second, surprisingly quiet now, then slowly removed the tape around his shoulder. Pedro froze slightly. There were bruises everywhere. Dark marks across Kenneth's ribs. Old scars near his shoulder. fresh purple bruising near his collarbone. Pedro swallowed hard. Jesus. Kenneth gave a small laugh. Football's romantic. No wonder you're always exhausted. Kenneth leaned back against the wall. Comes with the job. Pedro grabbed the medical wrap nearby and carefully started helping rebandage his shoulder. Kenneth stayed completely still while watching him. The silence felt different than usual. Softer. You know, Kenneth said quietly after a minute. Most people only care when I'm winning. Pedro kept focusing on the bandage. That's stupid. Yeah. Kenneth smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. Pedro finally looked up at him. Kenneth was already looking back. Not flirtatious this time. Not joking. Just tired. And weirdly honest. For the first time since all this started, Pedro realized Kenneth Walker might actually be lonely. You make me feel quiet, Kenneth said softly. Pedro's hands stopped moving. What? Kenneth looked away toward the floor like he regretted saying it out loud. Nothing. But Pedro heard it. And worse, he understood it. That night Kenneth texted him for the first time. Kenneth, shoulder still attached. Tragic news for my enemies. Pedro stared at the message way longer than necessary before replying. Pedro, your enemies are praying for your downfall. Kenneth, wow. Toxic boyfriend behavior. Pedro smiled despite himself. That became another problem. He was smiling more now. Over the next 2 weeks, fake dating slowly started feeling less fake. Kenneth began spending almost every free moment around him. Sometimes they studied together in the library. Sometimes Kenneth dragged Pedro to late-night diners after practice because athletes require pancakes for survival. And somehow Kenneth was always touching him now. Nothing inappropriate. Just small things. A hand against Pedro's lower back while guiding him through crowds. Fingers brushing Pedro's wrist while handing him coffee. Leaning against his shoulder during movies. Tiny things. Tiny dangerous things. One rainy Thursday night, Pedro was working on an art project in his dorm when someone knocked on the door at almost midnight. Mateo opened it and immediately grinned. Your boyfriend's here. Kenneth walked in completely soaked from the rain holding a tiny cake box. Pedro blinked. Why are you wet? Kenneth looked down at himself. Excellent observation skills. No, seriously. Why are you here? Kenneth suddenly looked awkward for the first time all week. You mentioned once you never really celebrated birthdays growing up. Pedro froze. He barely remembered saying that. Kenneth held up the cake box. So happy birthday? Pedro stared at him silently. It wasn't even a big cake. Just a tiny cheap chocolate one from the grocery store nearby. Slightly crooked frosting. Probably rushed. But no one besides Mateo had remembered Pedro's birthday in years. Mateo quietly grabbed his laptop and left the room without saying anything. Pedro looked back at Kenneth. You did all this for me? Kenneth shrugged like it wasn't important, but Pedro noticed the nervous way he rubbed the back of his neck. It's dumb, Kenneth muttered. I just thought. Before he could finish, Pedro hugged him. It happened so fast neither of them seemed prepared for it. Kenneth went completely still. Pedro immediately realized what he'd done and pulled back fast. Sorry, Kenneth grabbed his wrist gently before he could move away. No, he said softly. Don't apologize for that. Their eyes locked. Pedro's chest felt tight suddenly. Kenneth smiled a little. You know something weird? What? You're the first person who's hugged me without asking for something after. Pedro didn't know what to say to that. So instead they sat on the floor eating cheap birthday cake at midnight while rain hit the windows outside. At some point Kenneth ended up lying on Pedro's bed with one arm over his eyes while Pedro worked on sketches beside him. You ever think about the future? Kenneth asked quietly. Pedro shrugged. Sometimes. Kenneth stared at the ceiling. My dad already planned mine before I was even born. Pedro glanced over. Kenneth laughed softly, but it sounded tired. Football. Professional league. Marriage. Kids. Whole perfect American dream package. You don't want that? Kenneth was quiet for a few seconds. Then finally he said, I've dated girls because it was easier. Pedro's pencil stopped moving. Kenneth still wasn't looking at him. It made people comfortable, he continued quietly. My teammates, my family, everybody. He swallowed once. But with you, he looked over finally. I don't feel like I'm pretending all the time. Pedro's heartbeat started acting stupid again. Neither of them spoke after that. But when Kenneth fell asleep 20 minutes later, he rolled closer unconsciously until his shoulder pressed lightly against Pedro's leg. And Pedro stayed awake almost the entire night staring at him. Pedro spent the next 3 days pretending everything was normal. It absolutely was not. Ever since that conversation in his dorm, something between him and Kenneth had shifted. The fake flirting still existed, the teasing still happened, but now there was something underneath it that neither of them knew how to control anymore. Pedro noticed it in small moments. The way Kenneth automatically searched for him in crowded rooms. The way his voice softened whenever he said Pedro's name. The way he touched Pedro like he was checking to make sure he was still there. And honestly, Pedro was just as bad. He started saving seats for Kenneth without thinking. Waiting for Kenneth's goodnight texts before sleeping. Watching football games just to see Kenneth smile afterward. Mateo noticed immediately. You're doomed, he announced while Pedro sat sketching in the dorm lounge. Pedro didn't look up. I'm fine. You drew him 7 times on 1 page. Pedro quickly flipped the sketchbook shut. Mateo pointed dramatically. Exhibit A. Before Pedro could defend himself, his phone buzzed. Kenneth, come outside. Pedro tried not to smile. Failed completely. When he stepped outside the dorm building, Kenneth was leaning against his motorcycle wearing a black hoodie and ripped jeans instead of his football jacket. You own normal clothes? Pedro asked. Kenneth gasped. Rude. Then he handed Pedro a helmet. Pedro frowned. What are we doing? Kidnapping. Kenneth. Relax, babe. I'm taking you somewhere. Pedro should have said no. Instead, 20 minutes later, he was sitting behind Kenneth on the motorcycle with both arms around his waist, while city lights blurred past them. Every time the bike turned slightly, Pedro instinctively held tighter. Kenneth definitely noticed, because he looked way too pleased about it. Eventually they stopped near a quiet beach outside town. The place was almost empty except for distant waves and cold wind rolling off the water. Pedro climbed off the bike slowly. You brought me to a beach at midnight? Kenneth shoved his hands into his pockets. I come here when my head gets too loud. That answer hit Pedro harder than expected. They walked along the shoreline quietly for a while. No crowds. No football team. No cameras. Just the sound of the ocean and Kenneth occasionally bumping his shoulder against Pedro's like he couldn't help himself. This is the longest I've gone without checking my phone in years, Kenneth admitted. Pedro smirked. Miracles happen. Kenneth laughed softly, then suddenly stopped walking. Pedro turned toward him. Kenneth was already staring at him. Not joking. Not teasing. Just staring. You know what the worst part is? Kenneth asked quietly. Pedro swallowed. What? I don't think this feels fake anymore. The air suddenly felt colder. Pedro's chest tightened painfully because he had been trying not to think the exact same thing for days. Kenneth stepped closer slowly. Tell me I'm imagining it. Pedro couldn't. That terrified him. Before he could respond, Kenneth's phone started ringing loudly. The moment shattered instantly. Kenneth cursed under his breath after checking the screen. Coach! Pedro stepped back automatically. Kenneth answered the call, already sounding tense. Yeah. Pedro tried not to listen, but Kenneth's expression changed immediately. No, I understand. Silence. I said I understand. By the time the call ended, Kenneth looked angry. What happened? Pedro asked carefully. Kenneth forced a smile that didn't look real. Nothing. That didn't sound like nothing. Kenneth looked away toward the ocean. Coach thinks I've been distracted lately. Pedro immediately felt guilty. Kenneth noticed his expression and sighed. Don't do that. Do what? Blame yourself. Pedro crossed his arms. Easy for you to say. Kenneth stepped closer again. Pedro. The way he said his name made it hard to breathe sometimes. I'm here because I want to be, Kenneth said softly. Nobody forced me. Pedro looked down at the sand. Your entire future depends on football. And people like your coach probably don't want you sneaking around with some guy from the art building. Kenneth's jaw tightened slightly. You think I care about that? Pedro didn't answer. Because honestly, yes, part of him believed eventually Kenneth would choose football over him. Felt inevitable. Kenneth suddenly reached forward and tilted Pedro's chin up gently. Look at me. Pedro did. Kenneth's voice dropped lower. I'm tired of pretending you don't matter. Pedro's heartbeat went completely insane. Then Kenneth kissed him. Soft at first. Careful. Like he was giving Pedro time to pull away. Pedro didn't. The second Kenneth's hand slid against the side of his neck, Pedro kissed him back hard enough to make Kenneth stumble slightly in surprise. Kenneth laughed softly into the kiss before pulling him closer. Everything disappeared for a minute. The pressure. The fear. The noise. Just Kenneth. When they finally pulled apart, Kenneth rested his forehead against Pedro's and whispered, There you are. Pedro felt completely wrecked. On the ride back to campus, Pedro couldn't stop smiling into Kenneth's shoulder, which made what happened the next afternoon hurt even worse. Pedro was heading toward the student center when he heard Kenneth's voice coming from the hallway outside the locker rooms. I can't destroy my future over feelings. Pedro stopped walking immediately. His stomach dropped. Kenneth sounded frustrated. Exhausted. Another teammate laughed quietly. Then cut him loose before this gets worse. Pedro froze. Everything inside him suddenly felt cold. Kenneth sighed heavily. You don't get it. Pedro didn't stay long enough to hear the rest. He turned around and walked away before Kenneth could see him. By the time Kenneth finally texted him later that night, Pedro had already convinced himself he understood everything. Kenneth, where'd you disappear to? Pedro stared at the message without replying. A minute later, another appeared. Kenneth, you okay? Then another. Kenneth, babe? Pedro muted the conversation and tossed the phone onto his bed. His chest hurt. And the worst part? He knew Kenneth cared about him. That was what made it harder. Because if Kenneth really liked him and still thought Pedro might ruin his future, then what chance did they actually have? The next morning, Kenneth was waiting outside Pedro's class holding 2 coffees like usual. The second he saw Pedro, his entire face brightened. Pedro almost broke right there. Instead, he walked past him. Kenneth blinked in confusion. Pedro. Pedro kept walking. Behind him, he heard Kenneth jogging to catch up. Hey, what happened? Pedro stopped finally but refused to look at him. You were right, he said quietly. Kenneth frowned. About what? This was fake. Kenneth went completely still. Pedro forced himself to continue before he lost courage. You don't have to keep pretending anymore. Kenneth stared at him like he'd been punched in the chest. Pretending? Pedro laughed bitterly. I heard you yesterday. Realization flashed across Kenneth's face instantly. Oh! For a second, Kenneth looked panicked. Then genuinely scared. Pedro, he said quickly, stepping closer. You didn't hear the full conversation. I heard enough. No, you didn't. Pedro finally looked at him then. Kenneth's eyes looked desperate. And somehow that only made Pedro's chest hurt more. Kenneth followed Pedro all the way across campus, but Pedro refused to stop walking. Students turned to stare as the football captain chased after the quiet art student through the middle of Westbridge like his entire life depended on it. Honestly, maybe it did. Pedro, please just listen to me. Pedro kept moving faster. There's nothing to explain. There is when you walk away before hearing the full sentence. Pedro finally stopped near the back entrance of the art building and turned around sharply. Then explain it. Kenneth looked exhausted already. Dark circles sat under his eyes like he hadn't slept at all. I said I couldn't destroy my future over feelings, Kenneth admitted carefully. But you didn't stay long enough to hear the rest. Pedro crossed his arms tightly. Kenneth swallowed once. I said I'd regret losing you even more. Silence. Pedro stared at him. Kenneth stepped closer slowly. You seriously thought I was talking about getting rid of you? You said it to your teammate. Because they were telling me to stop seeing you. Kenneth's voice cracked slightly. And I told them I couldn't. Pedro's anger weakened for half a second before fear replaced it again. Your coach already thinks I'm distracting you. He thinks breathing is distracting. That's not funny. Kenneth rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. Pedro, look at me. He waited until Pedro finally did. I know this is messy. I know I'm bad at explaining things sometimes. But I need you to believe one thing. His voice softened. You matter more to me than football. Pedro immediately looked away, because that terrified him more than anything. Kenneth. No, Kenneth stepped forward again. I'm done pretending this is casual. Pedro's chest tightened painfully. Kenneth laughed once, nervous this time. Honestly? I think I've been screwed since the night I fell asleep on you at that stupid party. Pedro almost smiled despite himself. Almost. But fear still sat heavily inside him. You don't understand, Pedro whispered. People like me don't get endings like this. Kenneth frowned immediately. What does that mean? It means eventually this becomes too hard. Your team hates me. Your coach hates me. Your future. My future is mine. Pedro shook his head. Not completely. For a second neither of them spoke. Then Kenneth quietly asked, Did somebody make you feel like loving you was inconvenient? Pedro froze. That question hit way too close to old wounds he never talked about anymore. Kenneth's expression softened immediately like he already knew the answer. You're not something I'm ashamed of, he said gently. Pedro looked down at the ground because suddenly his eyes burned. Kenneth moved closer carefully this time, like approaching something fragile. I don't know how to do this perfectly, he admitted. But I know I want you, Pedro whispered. You could lose everything. Kenneth gave a small sad smile. And I'm still standing here. That finally broke something inside Pedro. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for him to step closer instead of away. Kenneth's shoulders visibly relaxed the second the distance between them disappeared. Okay, Pedro whispered. Okay what? We try for real. Kenneth stared at him for one stunned second before immediately pulling him into a hug so tight Pedro nearly lost oxygen. You have no idea how close I was to losing my mind, Kenneth muttered against his hair. Pedro laughed weakly into his chest. You're kind of dramatic. Kind of. For the first time in 2 days, Pedro genuinely smiled. Things should have gotten easier after that. Instead, everything exploded. 3 days later, Kenneth got called into his coach's office after practice. By the time he came out, the entire football team already knew something bad happened. Kenneth found Pedro waiting outside the stadium that evening. One look at Kenneth's face and Pedro's stomach dropped. What happened? Kenneth looked away. Coach suspended me for next week's game. Pedro blinked. What? He said I've been distracted. Said the media attention is becoming a problem. Guilt slammed into Pedro immediately. Kenneth, it's not your fault. Yes, it is. Kenneth grabbed his wrist gently before he could pull away. No, it's not. But later that night things got even worse. Kenneth's father arrived on campus. Pedro had only heard stories about him before. Former professional athlete. Cold. Demanding. The kind of man who treated emotions like weaknesses. Pedro accidentally saw them arguing outside the stadium parking lot. You're throwing away your future, his father snapped. Kenneth looked furious. You mean your future? You think professional teams want this scandal attached to you? Pedro immediately backed away before either of them noticed him. His chest felt sick. By midnight, Pedro had convinced himself staying with Kenneth would eventually destroy everything Kenneth worked for. 3 days later, Pedro quietly submitted transfer papers to another university. Mateo found out first and completely lost it. You're seriously leaving? Pedro kept stuffing clothes into a bag. It's the right thing. For who? Pedro didn't answer, because deep down, part of him knew he wasn't only scared for Kenneth. He was scared Kenneth might eventually regret choosing him. The night before he planned to leave, Pedro stopped by the empty physical therapy room one last time to grab some sketch supplies he left there weeks ago. He didn't realize he forgot his sketchbook behind. Kenneth found it an hour later. At first he smiled seeing Pedro's name on the cover. Then he opened it. Everything inside nearly destroyed him. Sketch after sketch after sketch. Pedro had drawn him constantly. Kenneth laughing in the cafeteria. Kenneth asleep in the library. Kenneth sitting on the hood of his motorcycle. Kenneth looking at Pedro like he was something precious. And on the final page, written messily beneath a half-finished drawing, I loved him long before I knew what to call it. Kenneth immediately ran. Not metaphorically. Actually ran. Through rain. Through traffic. Across half the city toward the train station Mateo told him about 15 minutes earlier while yelling, "If you lose him, I swear to God." By the time Kenneth reached the station, he was soaked completely through and struggling to breathe. Pedro was already standing beside the train doors. For one horrible second Kenneth thought he was too late. Then Pedro looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded station. Kenneth moved instantly. "Pedro!" People turned to stare. Pedro's expression shattered the second he saw him. Kenneth finally reached him breathless and shaking slightly. "Don't go." Pedro's eyes filled immediately. "Kenneth! I mean it." Kenneth grabbed his hands tightly. "Don't leave because you think you're ruining my life." Pedro looked wrecked already. "Your father. My father doesn't get to decide who I love." The word hung between them. Love. Kenneth laughed shakily. "Yeah, there it is." Pedro started crying quietly. Kenneth stepped even closer, completely ignoring the dozens of strangers watching them now. "I love you," he said again, softer this time. "I love you and I don't care who knows anymore." Pedro wiped at his face quickly. "You're going to lose things because of me." Kenneth shook his head immediately. "No. I lose things when I live somebody else's life instead of mine." The train doors began beeping behind them. Last call. Pedro looked back once, then back at Kenneth. Kenneth's voice cracked slightly. "Please stay." Pedro didn't even realize he was moving until he crashed into Kenneth's arms. Kenneth held him so tightly it almost hurt. Around them, people were openly staring now. Some recording. Some smiling. Neither of them cared anymore. Kenneth buried his face against Pedro's neck and whispered shakily, "You scared the hell out of me." Pedro laughed through tears. "You deserve it a little." Kenneth pulled back just enough to look at him properly. "Probably." Then Pedro kissed him. Right there in the middle of the station. No hiding. No pretending. No fake dating. Just them. And for the first time since this whole mess started, Pedro stopped feeling afraid of what came next. Because Kenneth was kissing him like staying mattered more than winning ever had. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. What started as one drunken mistake at a Halloween party became the most real thing either of them had ever known. Kenneth stopped living for everyone else's expectations, and Pedro finally stopped hiding himself from the world. They still argued over stupid things, still teased each other constantly, and Kenneth definitely still called him babe way too much. But now, every time he said it, Pedro smiled instead of flinching. Because this time it was real. And honestly, neither of them would have changed a single thing. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.